Button.
All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Magdalena Buchek, and I am a licensed psychologist working at Cognitive Behavioral Consultants, primarily at their White Plains office, but we also have offices in the city. We specialize in cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy. We offer a programming for younger children and honestly across the lifespan, and we do a lot of school consulting. My background actually is in psychology, school psychology. I am a licensed school psychologist. I did all my training in the schools, and that's why I feel very passionate disseminating evidence-based interventions into schools. And I've been working with the Pound School District now for 3 years. So today, I want to talk to you parents on how to best support your families in this transition back to school. So right, Julie, you were saying that for the high school, they're not all fully in full 5 days a week, but it is still a big difference than they've been experiencing in the last couple of months, right?
Yeah, we probably had about 60% in, and then we're going to have probably about 80% in. So majority of our kids will be in about 4 days a week instead of five, instead of 2 to 3. So before it was 2 to 3, now it's 3 to 4 days per week.
Okay, great. So definitely still a transition. So we'll talk a little bit about those. So though I'll primarily emphasize some of the emotions related to anxiety, thoughts related to like worries and uncertainty, a big theme also for us teens will be for us teens. I mean, I wish I was a teen. For your teens, will be also thinking about sadness and some of those negative emotions that they might be experiencing as they are more vulnerable to experiencing that transition of anxiety, experiencing anxiety for so long, transitioning into emotions such as sadness. So we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like, what could be typical in this transition, what might not be typical, and what we can do about it. So we'll touch on some coping strategies, both that for you and your teens. We'll talk a little bit about how to communicate with your teenagers about emotions, about any concerns you might be having about them, and any anxiety that they might be experiencing, or overall, like if you have any worry thoughts about their functioning, and this transition, how to address any stressors that might not make this transition a success for students. So we'll talk a little bit how we can reduce some vulnerabilities. So what I want you guys to think about is this framework of how our thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and our bodily sensations are interconnected, right? Because I think that when we think about all the emotions we experienced in the last year, we're all very emotionally vulnerable. And this really does impact in how we perceive threats, perceive situations that we're in, how that then impacts our behavior, right? And the variety of emotions that we experience. I think having this as our framework will open the door to having more empathy and understanding for some of the behaviors that we might not necessarily like, right? So understanding that the emotions really are underlying the influence on how teenagers and ourselves as parents behave towards our kids. So, I think thinking about everything that we've gone through in 2020 and continuing into 2021, it really did involve a lot of anxiety, right? So if anxiety is the emotion, worry is the thought, and uncertainty is a type of a worry thought, right? And so much uncertainty, even in this transition, thinking about all the things that might be going well as of recent, it's still a lot to be uncertain about. So we're constantly in this heightened state, right? Where our nervous system, that fight or flight system, is activated, right? So for some, it might be prone to setting up for the fight, right? So the adrenaline and the heightened emotions really make us more reactive, right? Versus some of us might be experiencing the heightened emotional state and really noticing the urge to flee, right? So there is a common theme that we've been possibly noticing of these urges to avoid, right? Especially since avoidance has been so rewarded in 2020, and continuing in 2021, that it might be, really hard to manage some of those urges to either, combat and notice the reactivity in response to these emotions, or perhaps having that urge to avoid. So this is really like the emotional context that, yeah, I want you all to kind of think about your teens, as well as also noticing how you might be experiencing similar cycles. So some of the things that I just remember being so petrified about, as a therapist working primarily with teens, is some of the initial headlines and concerns that were coming up for teens, right? I think the biggest concern really was for the teenage population because, developmentally, this is the time to be most social, right? Where their values really are primarily social. So to then have all that pulled, some things, some traditions, school related, whether they missed camp opportunities, events at school that they were looking for and worked so hard towards to be all pulled for them. It made sense that a lot of the concern really was about how are teenagers going to tolerate and deal with a social isolation, right? And this constant, influx of social media and news headlines. And, they're developmentally at a state where they are more susceptible to information. So, even their understanding, not really being certain about what they make of all this, right? Then there's also the vulnerability for disrupted sleep in the teenage population. So there is definitely a lot of concern. And of course, there are some scary numbers out there that are showing that many teens who, struggled pre-pandemic are faring pretty poorly right now, right? With increased rates of depression and anxiety. And this headline, I remember getting it, that how like there are pockets of surges of suicide completions across our country and across the world, which is so incredibly sad, right? And I think what some of the surprising data that actually hasn't been part of the headlines, as I literally had to search for raw surveys to actually indicate that many teens, in comparison to studies in 2018, actually did endorse experiencing less anxiety in the pandemic, actually endorse improvements in their mood, right? So actually slightly less depression, not a significant change in depression rates amongst like the general population, but some also surprisingly endorse improved relationships with their families. Right. So personally, my initial worry thoughts of like increased conflict, right, and increased mental health issues, there are actually pretty positive statistics out there. So what we know is our kids can be really resilient. And for some, the pandemic might have worked in their favor. Though, of course, now kind of slowly starting to come back into some more typical routines, we might start to notice some behavioral and emotional issues popping up. So I want us to kind of focus on what to potentially cope ahead for. Oh, sorry. I think this is all right. So to start, what are your concerns? I don't know if anyone wants to jump in and share something on their minds. I think primarily some of the feedback that Julia has gotten really focused around, you know, academic declines, right? Perhaps some avoidance towards academic tasks, changes. And, I think like if your student might have been a high achieving student pre-pandemic, noticing changes in their approaches to school has been concerning, as well as also like the return to socializing, right? So after, so much time spent apart, what is it going to be like to return, right? Are their social circles going to look different? Are their interactions going to be different? Anything else that, potentially I can think about as we go through this presentation? If something does pop up, feel free to chat it in or just unmute and join the conversation. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what are some common reactions that we can potentially expect. So, with that mindset of understanding that, our teenagers, not only are they already from a developmental standpoint, right, in a heightened hormonal state, they might have been potentially experiencing a prolonged heightened emotional state in the last year. All right. So some of these behavioral and emotional common reactions we'll really be thinking about it from the framework of this prolonged period of heightened emotions. And also transitions, right? Thinking about how we adjust to change, especially after such a long period of time of, getting used to, what was the new normal and now getting back to things. The transition time period will likely be longer. So I think key to look out for and what might be most challenging is a consistent sleep hygiene, right? It seemed, and I even see it within myself, like that extra hour of sleep really has had a positive improvement on mood. Now having to readjust some sleep, perhaps getting less sleep, might really get teens stuck in that cycle of late night staying up, waking up early, grogginess, and issues around bedtime and wake up. This could potentially make them more vulnerable to physical complaints or even experiencing some new anxieties. So this can be related to sleep, but also again, like going back to an unknown situation that's going to include new rules, new setups, things that they're not used to. We might potentially see having more difficulty with authority, increased oppositionality, and this might not just be with you as parents, but also in the school setting as well. So, for those who might thinking about that heightened emotional state, right? If their inclination is to be more reactive, they might be more impulsive and therefore engage in some ineffective decision making. They might be more sensitive to criticism. So, if they are potentially more vulnerable to anxiety and getting some, feedback, especially if pre-pandemic they might have not been often receiving feedback, they might be overreactive to criticism in this transition. They might be more jumpy. And again, that is in line with being in a slightly more emotional state. So they're more likely to be reactive. There, you might notice a decrease in motivation, right? So, if they potentially were in a cycle of taking classes, from their comforts of their home, some maybe in bed in their PJs, and that already might have been impacting their motivation to now then make the switch and, try to get a more structured routine. We might not see such excitement towards that routine. We might see a decrease in engagement in activities. So something surprising, I hypothesize that after long periods of time of not, attending birthday parties or sports or, activities that they might be passionate about, it is possible that if they, because it's been such a long time and they're starting to, experience more of like the negative mood following long periods of anxiety and uncertainty, it's possible that we might see a dip in their engagement in activities. And of course, increased screen time, right? Thinking as conceptualizing screen time as a form of emotional avoidance, right? If they're feeling overwhelmed with academic demands, social demands in this transition, it is definitely possible that they are going to be spending more time on screens. It is definitely an easier escape versus actually confronting reality. And the other surprising thing, right? Like we would think that after being isolated for so long, they might want to jump right into social interactions. But I've been hearing a lot of concerns about like things being weird or relationship statuses being uncertain, which has led to some potentially like more avoidance. So you might actually see students isolating. And so these can be common reactions, and there are things that we can do about it. So if you see these, in the first couple of weeks in the transition, I would say that that will likely be normative. So what's typical for us as parents, right? Especially as we're feeling really concerned for our teens, it is likely that we too will be experiencing similar, symptoms in this transition and just in general as being parenting and the pandemic, which has been taking such a toll on parental mental health. Is you might notice, also decreases in motivation, increased irritability, right? Like, if I could do anything, it would be to wave a magic wand and make everything like return to normalcy and things and routines and things just like be back and it be an easy transition. So we decreased our vulnerability to being irritable and frustrated that things just aren't the way that they are, like aren't the way that they used to be. This can come with increases in sadness for ourselves, sadness for our kids that they're not experiencing, what the experiences we had in high school, increased anxiety or worry, right? I can't imagine what it must be like to be a parent, for a teenager. Like, I'm both grateful that my daughter's only 19 months old. I can't imagine like what it might be like thinking about college or exams or academic performance in this time because that seems so seemingly unimportant given everything that's going on, and at the same time it is pretty freaking important, right? So it's this like tough challenge to be in. Increased fatigue, I mean, the amount of information overload on you parents, it's a lot, right? So it's both physical and mental fatigue you might be experiencing. Increased guilt, right? I think, as parents making the decisions for our families and all the risk evaluation and decisions about school and sports and activities and the requests that were being made from our teenagers, from our work environments, it's a lot. And so when we make those decisions and question ourselves, we might be experiencing a lot of unhelpful parental guilt, changes in our own appetite, connecting that emotional overload can definitely, lead to a difficulty with concentration for parents, including also difficulties with executive functioning. So much to manage, schedule, routine, and whatnot. All that can translate into not so great executive functioning skills and your own physiological distress. So just being mindful that headaches, stomach aches, changes in appetite, all that is perfectly normal during this because we are still in crisis mode. So considering those factors that might be common reactions to the pandemic and this transition, right? What we want to kind of keep in mind is there is a timeline for when those types of reactions are normative. If we begin to see, kind of past those 3-4 weeks after the transition has occurred, kind of thinking more than a month of noticing maybe complete social withdrawal, significant academic decline, or continued lack of engagement in school, perhaps skipping classes, not attending school, or being late consistently, maybe potentially hearing it for an extended period of time, self-critical thoughts, maybe even some suicidal communication. Those would be signs that would indicate that perhaps their sadness is reaching a level in which help would be warranted. So those are the factors that I really want you to consider. So though we have these totally normal responses that initially are concerning, it's really looking out for how long those reactions are going to be lasting, right? So all these different emotions are totally valid in this transition. So they might be continuing feeling sad, anxious, disappointed, and also feeling excitement about the potential of things, getting better and things returning to normal. So all these different experiences, right, are going to be normal. And we're going to talk a little bit more how we can validate that in a couple of slides. Any questions about potential red flags and what to do about them? Okay. So the other thing that I want you all to be mindful about is honoring that anxiety in a transition when change comes is totally normal, right? It really can be scary. Everything that we're dealing with is scary. And the uncertainty really does increase and maintain that anxiety. However, if avoidance starts to be problematic, right? So whether that is avoiding people, places, activities that they normally would engage in, which is leading to a lot of like significant distress. Maybe your teen is starting to experience panic attacks, really disrupted sleep, including nightmares, difficulty falling asleep. All that can potentially impact the likelihood that they might start to chronically avoid, right? So we really want to be mindful that now that we're returning back to school, it is a return back to school. And so we want to make sure that any sort of avoidance of school and school responsibilities does not become chronic. So, bottom line, again, kind of keeping this empathic mindset that we are all still operating in a crisis, parents, teens, kids, your school system, right? That we are all in crisis mode, really needing to pivot at the drop of, a change in stats that we have zero control over. And this is truly akin to what it's like to be in a chronic traumatic stressor. Like, that's a lot to hold right there, right? Like, and there are some strategies that we can keep in mind to try and minimize the impact of these chronic stressors, like right now on you and your children, like facing this transition. So, what can you do? And to be honest, it really does start with you as parents modeling adaptive coping. So, I think at the basis, at the foundation of what is going to be really helpful in a challenging transition is really focusing on emotions. So often, as parents, our natural inclination is to be a problem solver, right? Fixing it, right? We're very, given our life experiences and our teens' lack of experiences, we really want to help fix lots of their problems. But what we often miss are the emotions that teenagers are experiencing. Right? So, what we want to model is increasing our conversations around emotions. Right? What are we as parents feeling these days? So, I would recommend kind of, potentially considering having an emotional family check-in. Right? It doesn't have to be anything super formal. Maybe it is over dinner. Maybe it's before you sit down and watch that family show, but honestly, being mindful to scheduling a couple of minutes, intentionally welcoming and accepting emotional experiencing, right? So from your end, being able to label your own emotions and thoughts and physical sensations and be able to kind of express that to your teens, sitting with any sort of vulnerability and losses, and though I understand the potential of your teens not paying attention to you, right? If you're consistent with it and trying to hold conversations about what they might have been feeling that day, what you were feeling that day, the consistency is what will eventually catch on. Right. And the goal really is for you to be the model for emotional expression and touching in on like, hey, like today I really had a stressful time at work. And whoa, did I made this mistake because I was really struggling to stay focused, right? Like today was a not so great day for me, right? That made me feel really disappointed. I felt guilty. And so, today, right, like emotionally, I'm feeling drained. So being able to communicate that, label that in itself is going to be validating for your teens. So starting up that conversation and honoring that all feelings make sense. Now, hopefully, this emotional check in will lead to an opportunity to validate, right? Though it's possible that your teens will be rejecting of talking about their feelings, but if you even get like an inclination of what they might have emotionally experienced that day, latch onto it and validate. Right. So, validation is acknowledging that those feelings, those thoughts, those actions make perfect sense, are accurate, and are acceptable in a particular situation. Now, at the same time, we also want to make sure that we're not validating what's invalid, right? Having the urge to not go to school makes sense if anxiety is high, right? And not going to school, that's not valid. Like, that's not valid. That's where we'll work on like the change part. But we can honor that we're feeling really sad or we're struggling with our anxiety, and that might make us not want to go to school. That makes sense. So you want to like talk, listen, and encourage and model that expression, right? In the moment as they're giving you any sort of inkling of an emotional experience, whether it is kind of prompting some questions about how are you feeling about going back to school, or for those who, who might be, staying home, or even like what are their thoughts, feelings about the continued like combination of experiences in this transition back. Is there anything that they're worried or concerned about? Are there anything that they're feeling excited about? We do want to honor, right, that there's potential for a positive experiencing in this strange transition as well. You can also express how you're feeling about them going back to school. Maybe it's about, honoring your own anxiety about their first couple of days, right? Because we know transitions can be hard, particularly if you do already have a vulnerable teen, right? And you can also express the excitement that like your teens are going to see friends and there is this potential of things going back to normal. Some examples of validating statements is kind of thinking big picture that, like, yes, we're still in the midst of a global health crisis that none of us have ever faced before, right? Like, your schools had never had to deal with the scramble of trying to figure out like how to follow these ever changing guidelines and make schools safe and catch, exposure and change things around all that. Like that, it sounds like an administrative nightmare. I would rather like hide away from those types of responsibilities. So honoring that if they're expressing feelings of frustration, maybe this potential of feeling anxious about, the potential of needing to quarantine or things getting shut down again, or, I think what I've been like hearing across like districts is like if certain teens do get like exposed, potentially missing experiences that are tied to I don't know, I think there was something else like I don't know, like what senior traditions and things like that. And if you have to miss that, holy shit, that's gonna be really incredibly tough on a teenager having to see those pictures on social media and not being a part of that. That I think will lead to a lot of sadness. I mean, I just even hearing those stories makes me sad. But so honoring anything, right? It makes sense that you're experiencing this, or following new rules and getting used to them, that is incredibly hard, right? Like, changes in traditions, that really sucks. So putting yourself in your teenager's shoes and really, validating like what this experience might be like for them. Tip three would be really trying to work on reducing vulnerabilities. So kind of think, so vulnerabilities are anything that can impact, right, your teen's likelihood that they will experience a heightened emotion, right? So thinking about, if we're feeling under the weather or on a day when we don't have that much sleep, right, we're more likely to be cranky, right? When we haven't eaten lunch, we are hangry. We're more likely to be reactive. Our attention span gets impacted. So thinking about teenagers, right, where they already are experiencing inconsistencies in those factors, what we want to do as parents is try to provide some structure around these vulnerabilities, right? So focusing on sleep. This is incredibly hard for teenagers. I'll give you that. What we want to do is encourage consistent sleep routine and a schedule. So what that might look like is whether that is, modeling that for yourselves, potentially having like a family like phone hand in time where, if you need to study later, you can use your computer, but shutting down apps or access to cell phones at a certain hour can be helpful in being consistent about it. If you're worried that your teen is up in the wee hours of the morning on social media or doing homework really late night, think, I would err on the side of prioritizing sleep over finishing those assignments at like 1, 2 a.m. So shutting off Wi-Fi, come 11 p.m., midnight, if needed. Limiting screen time if it is interfering with responsibilities. So We get it. I think majority of teenagers do have unlimited access to social media, or, just Wi-Fi in general, texting, FaceTiming, all the different apps, TikTok, whatnot. Not all families limit social media use, and it's not that that's not effective. It only becomes problematic if it starts to interfere with responsibilities. So if you're noticing increases in handing in assignments late, drop in grades, avoidance, attendance shifting in the student that typically goes to school, difficulties waking up in the morning, all these are potentially impacted by unlimited screen time use. So some apps that can be helpful for parents to use, to shut down apps after a certain amount of time, include Bark, Life 360. I know on Apple, if you have an iPhone, through Apple you can control screen time within your family. And then I'm not sure if they're the Bark and Life 360 you pay for. I think originally they were free. I know that Circle is a service that you do pay for the subscription, but those you can control application usage. Of course, we know our teens are so incredibly tech savvy, so it might take frequent changes in passwords, if you as a family are using Netflix, Hulu, streaming services, potentially considering changing passwords if your teens are breaking family limits. Any questions about limiting social media use, screen time use? Full disclosure, it is very likely that if your teen has had unlimited access and then you put limits on it, it will be very challenging for them to accept those limits. And you might experience what we call an extinction burst. So an increase in disruptive behaviors, meaning they will escalate, they will tantrum like they might have as toddlers, at Target crying for, candy or a toy. And of course, like that behavior, as long as you're consistent, will eventually subside. I think limiting screen time, especially with the vulnerability being like, yes, we're still in a pandemic. Yes, social interactions are still limited, but there are ways to, keep iMessage on, FaceTime on, while still limiting other potentially school interfering programs. Ideally, we would want to limit screens at least 1 hour before bed. There is strong research support that, continued electronic usage until right before bed does have an impact on your body's melatonin production. So it can be harder to fall asleep and stay asleep. So highly recommend kind of creating a family rule around limiting electronics before bedtime. During a pandemic, of course, being at home, unstructured eating has become totally normative. So, teens already at baseline don't eat breakfast. So, some ways to help with attention and energy levels really will be to model and really reinforce breakfast eating. They might potentially not have lunch at school if they are more preoccupied with engaging with their peers, or, they might have less time to eat at lunchtime. So just trying to be mindful and at least keeping certain meals consistent and at a same time every day. Coping ahead. So if your teen is coming to you about stressful situations, maybe it is about social situations being different, try to have a conversation and engage in some uh, problem solving around that. So what that might look like is asking questions first, right? So how might you think, what are some things that you envision yourself like feeling in that situation? What are some emotions that might come up for you? What might you want to say to that person when you see them? What might you want to do? Let's talk about what that might look like. It's almost like you're kind of walking them in advance of kind of coping through a stressful situation. Now, this is where our urge to give them those solutions might come in. So just be mindful and guide them into coming up with their own solutions by asking more questions, versus offering more solutions. Scheduling pleasant activities. If your teen is more vulnerable to continuing to stay isolated, or perhaps if there are, activities that they are struggling to engage in, trying to schedule some pleasant activities as a family, or, encouraging time spent outdoors, or, going places that are safe, incorporating some things that teens can look forward to on the weekends, or potentially throughout the week as well. If they're struggling in this transition and kind of dragging their feet to school, having some things to look forward to can help with coping ahead and encouraging them to get through a tough day. So this goes for you as well. As parents, in terms of like modeling and reducing your own vulnerabilities, being mindful of sleep, limiting your own screen usage and information overload. This might be being mindful of your own social media exposure, news exposure, um, eating healthy, and also coping ahead for stressful conversations, situations, etc. Any questions about reducing vulnerabilities or the potential of this being a challenge? If you're worried about those red flags I mentioned a couple slides ago, really truly consider reducing vulnerabilities by implementing some limits. If targeting those vulnerabilities is hard, if you're not noticing any behavioral change in a couple of weeks, consider increasing reinforcement and be mindful of using punishment sparingly. So, what we mean by increasing reinforcement, we don't off the bat mean, pour out all the rewards, right? It can start at just paying attention to what your teens are doing. Very often, especially when we're vulnerable ourselves, our camera lens is focused on what they are not doing, right? On a day when we're irritable and where we're vulnerable, we're more likely to hang on to like the socks outside the hamper, right? The wet towels on the ground, right? The homework not like the dishes not put in the dishwasher. All that tends to lead to increases in focusing on the negative, what they're not doing. So try to reframe, and this is actually a helpful vulnerability reduction tool for parents, is focusing on the positive, right? So maybe that day, right, they did get out of bed. Give them a labeled praise. Don't just say, great job. Really make sure that you are letting them know what they did a great job of, right? Think like great job getting out of bed on time. Thank you for being consistent with going to school, right? If they made it through the first week of going back and you know that it was stressful for them, like they deserve lots of praise. So, really focusing on paying attention to the things that they're doing well. Your kids are resilient, they are likely doing a lot of things well. Just it is a lot harder to stay focused on those things when so much might not be going well. If behaviors do continue to be challenging and it's hard to, encourage your teens through praising, consider reasonable and realistic rewards. So, what that might also mean is taking some inventory of the privileges that they already have. Are they getting an allowance? When they come to you and they say, like, hey, mom, can I have $5 for Starbucks? Do they get that automatically? Do they have privileges with, using the family car, or are there, privileges around electronics? Thinking about like, can you use that to your advantage? Is increasing access to privileges something that you might be motivated to work towards? Getting nails done, or getting a new video game, is that something that you can potentially use to motivate behavior, right? So if they are automatically getting that, consider withholding those privileges if they're not fulfilling their responsibilities. So if a teenager did not go to school that week, right? We want to be mindful to not reward avoidance. So what that might mean is, the day of, if they're missing school, they probably shouldn't have access to Netflix during school hours, right? It is, potentially considering, this is where the sparing punishment might come in, that during those school hours that they're missing, shutting down access to those specific apps that might be interfering, right? Getting them out of bed. If they miss school, it's not meant to, catch up on sleep and stay snuggled up in bed. We are getting out, sitting at the table, sitting at your desk, at least doing something towards your schoolwork on those days, right? And if, let's say, the goal is to attend school at least those 3 days the first week and they don't, potentially considering withholding, activities or privileges on the weekends if it continues to be a pattern. What we want to also keep in mind is, our kids are going kind of essentially from like 0 to full 100, well, almost a full 100, right? With a slight school day still being some remote. So we want to shape behavior. So if if your teen is really struggling to attend school at all, really trying or complete schoolwork, trying to manage expectations and trying to slowly increase those expectations over time. So what we want to do is, if in the beginning the goal is to attend school 1 day a week, we're going to really lay on the reinforcement and try and get that consistent attendance and engagement at least that 1 day a week. Then next week, increase the expectation to 2 days a week, right? This might also kind of mean like thinking about how much time are they spending on academic tasks at home, right? If potentially, they aren't meeting expectations for completing assignments, consider structuring, time around completing those assignments. And, maybe if it's a very quick 45, half an hour, even in the beginning, potentially increasing those expectations as they get more consistent. Reinforce at any small step. So even if your kid doesn't meet an expectation that like you set forth, consider like really, really focus on what they were able to do. So even though you might be feeling disappointed, I really focus on what they were able to accomplish. Just because your teen isn't engaging doesn't mean that they don't care, they're lazy, or can't do it. Remember, they are coming from that emotional vulnerability. They've been in a heightened state. We don't know what it's like to be them right now. So this is incredibly, really hard. So, yes, I cannot imagine what it must be like thinking about how your teen was pre pandemic to what they might be experiencing now. It could be somewhat different, it could be drastically different. And know that now, as things begin to change and routine starts to be more consistent, there will be more opportunities to shape this behavior. Now, when your reinforcement isn't leading to change, allow for natural consequences to occur. What we mean by natural consequences is allowing the environment, aka your school, to give those natural consequences. If you kind of really targeted schoolwork, right, handing in assignments, grades, showing up for exams, you tried reinforcement consistently for multiple weeks, and they're still not doing anything, and consider accepting those lowered grades. Consider the consequences for missed attendance, whatever that might mean in your school, right? I know that at times, especially initially in this transition, some flexibility may be helpful, some accommodations may be helpful, but long term, if the behavior starts to be more chronic, then we actually do want our students to begin to experience natural consequences. Maybe it means failure. That is so incredibly hard to tolerate. And experiencing those natural consequences will actually be more effective for them in the long term. Again, we want to prevent this and we want to do the best we can as parents to set them up for success. So, using reinforcement, using the factors that you can control in your environment, but over time, if they're not responding to it so effectively, allowing those natural consequences to occur. Hold those limits, right? Be mindful of those freebies. So thinking about the freebies are the privileges, access to Wi-Fi, access to social media, access to allowances, social engagements on the weekends. if those responsibilities that, need to start taking priority, like school engagement, continue to be a challenge, really stay consistent with not dishing out those freebies, those privileges for free. Any questions about reinforcement, punishment, shaping behavior? Controlling the environment using reinforcement and punishment really is the evidence based approach to challenging teenage behaviors. It's I think thinking about yourselves as the vehicles of change, right? So often do we want, our teens to magically have the internal motivation to change and to be more motivated. And if that doesn't occur very quickly, thinking yourselves really as those like vehicles of change supporting their environment, that's where change really starts to take effect. Any questions about that? Okay. Another really helpful tip is to assess before you provide any sort of reassurance or problem solving, right? So again, when we see our kids in distress, our urge is to say, all you have to do is just do X, Y, and Z. Here's how I would break down that task. Here's how I would email that teacher. Here's how I would ask for that extension, right? That is our natural urge. And so what we often do is we minimize, right? We actually punish their own resilience, right? Their own capabilities to slow down and think about how they can approach their problem. The other thing that we sometimes do, because again, we're parents and we want them to feel better, so it does come from a good place, is reassure them. It's going to be fine. Everything's going to work out. It will get better. Now, what I've learned in the pandemic is that because we don't know when it's going to get better, optimism can be encouraging at times, and sometimes optimism can actually be invalidating, right? So, even though we as parents know that in the long term, like for our teens, it will get better and it will be fine, but depending on the day for them, whatever happened that day, whatever they're really worried about or pissed off about, it might not seem like optimism is on the horizon, right? So, whatever their vantage point is that day, that's what makes sense and what their experience is that day. So, that's why, given that we don't know fully where they're coming from, we want to be mindful of giving them reassurance. That toxic positivity, right? And we've been hearing that more often, right? I think, some things that like I've been experiencing is like, having had a baby in the pandemic and a toddler now in the pandemic, like hearing people like, oh, how lucky are you that you get to spend so much time with them? Like, that, depending on the day, that's kind of invalidating. So thinking about teens, right, depending on the day, that reassurance, that problem solving from you might not land. And then it might actually lead to more emotion dysregulation for them. So really try to assess first, ask questions, maybe share an observation like, listen, like I am noticing this change in your behavior and it's making me worried. What's going on? What can I do to support you? Do you want my support? Do you want my help? Ask those questions first. Make sure that before you offer them those suggestions, you're asking first. And if they are asking you for some reassurance, make sure that you're providing accurate information. So if they are concerned, whether that is about COVID or about, changing rules, make sure that you do know like what the facts are. And again, this is so incredibly challenging because those facts are ever changing. But providing more facts versus like what might be is definitely more helpful, right? So actually, we really want to err on the side of not giving too much reassurance, given that we don't really know. When all else fails, fall back on validation and focus on reinforcement and what you can control. Any questions about this slide? Think when I think about teens in distress, Just always goes back to like that natural urge to problem solve before we understand the full problem. So again, lead in with validation, lots of focus on the emotion before we get into problem solving. Tip 6 really is about you, your parents, taking care of yourself and focusing on your acceptance of the things that you can't control. So, managing your expectations. This can require a lot of adjusting, right? So, managing your expectations, like whether that is for you as parents, right? Thinking about, what we typically might be doing in certain crisis oriented situations, thinking about what we typically expect of our school system, of your partner, of your teens. So just remember, from a validating, more empathic interpretation, is that you are all doing the best you can in this moment, right? And so are your children, so are your partners, so are your teachers and administrators, right? And we all have to learn new skills. So this pivoting, this dealing with problems we did not ask for, right? We can learn skills, we can adapt. Pandemic best might look very different from non-pandemic best. Accepting that uncertainty, right? Whether or not your child is going to be required to quarantine in the first couple of days of school, who the heck knows? Maybe there'll be changes in sports schedules or proms and graduations, like all that is uncertain. So asking yourself, what can you control that day? What can't you control? Practice that acceptance. I love this image of like, today's weather problem of the day is like it being so freaking cold, but let's say it's raining. Rather than stewing in the, oh, I hate rain. Why is it raining? I wish it wasn't raining. Oh my God, my day is going to be made more difficult, on and on and on, versus, yep, it's raining. Sitting with just that. So we're practicing that acceptance, and even practicing some of your own encouragement of like, this too shall pass. This isn't going to be forever. This completely sucks. This is not how we pictured things to be. And we can get through it. We can get through it as a community, right? We can ask for help if needed. If that problem solving is leading to ineffective solutions or you're not seeing change, it's okay to reach out for help, reach out to your a school mental health support, asking others for some ideas to how to problem solve, before potentially getting some more help. So any questions or other concerns? That was like a lot of talking. I know I didn't touch on substance use. I don't know if that's like a potential. I know, whereas like I thought there would have been in the rates of substance use for teenagers, actually substance use has gone down in the pandemic due to lack of access to substances, which is fantastic. So that's why I didn't like bring that up, but there is potential, like if, socializing increases, it is a potential and, something to look out for as well. I know often substances and other parent talks for their teens does often come up. So be mindful of that if you're concerned. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Buchek. It doesn't look like any of the parents have any questions. Certainly, this recording will be made available to everyone. And if there are any follow-up questions, parents are welcome to reach out to me, and I can always pass along that question to Magda.
Yeah. Here is my email too. Feel free to reach out to me. Some helpful resources online in the Trauma Network has a lot of great pandemic resources, as well as like my colleagues over at the Child Mind Institute. They have a lot of helpful parenting blogs for a wide range of topics. So check out their website. Other than that, also, some information on CBC. If you want to reach out for help, we're here for you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you, parents, for joining us.
Have a great evening.
Thank you. Have a good night. Thanks.